On Christmas Eve, I was the only one left working overtime at the office. Until the cold air suddenly dropped. I looked up and saw my legendary, unapproachable, domineering boss standing in front of my desk. His first words almost made me freeze. "Emma, I need you to pretend to be my wife 4 days, $200,000. I froze. That was exactly the amount I'd saved for my grandmother's house. I signed the agreement. I put on the ring he'd personally placed on my finger. Then I followed him back to that cold, palatial manor. But in the contract, he emphasized only one rule: no falling in love. Whoever falls in love first gets out of this relationship. I thought I could do it. Just when I thought everything was settled, his voice was as soft as a confession. "Emma, I fell in love first."
Welcome to Airless's Romance Stories. Read the entire novel in one go. Message or comment to tell me what kind of story you'd like to read. Subscribe to the channel for daily updates. Airless reminds you, the story begins now.
The office was a ghost ship adrift in the silent, snow-dusted expanse of Christmas Eve. Outside, the city had surrendered to the holiday, its frantic energy finally hushed under a blanket of white. Inside, the only signs of life were the lonely hum of a server rack and the soft, rhythmic tapping of Emma Chen's keyboard. She was finishing one last report, a solitary lighthouse keeper in a sea of empty cubicles. Her focus was absolute, a shield against the quiet melancholy of the evening. It was a skill honed over a lifetime of Christmases spent on the periphery of other people's joy. A sudden shift in the air made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She didn't need to look up to know he was there. Her boss, Mr. Nathaniel Cross, possessed a presence that preceded him, an aura of quiet intensity that seemed to lower the temperature of any room he entered. His expensive leather shoes made no sound on the plush carpet, but she felt his stillness as he stopped directly in front of her desk. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, pulling her attention from the screen against her will. Slowly, she lifted her head. He stood with rigid posture, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his impeccably tailored trousers. His expression, usually a mask of cool, unreadable control, was fractured. Deep tension radiated from him, visible in the tight set of his jaw and the faint strain around his eyes. He looked like a man holding back a storm. "I need a favor," he said, his voice, usually so crisp and commanding, a low, strained rasp. "A favor I have no right to ask." Emma's fingers froze over the keys. This was unprecedented. In the 2 years she'd worked as his executive assistant, their interactions had been a model of professional distance. He was the brilliant, demanding CEO. She was the efficient, invisible cog in his machine. "Of course, Mr. Cross," she replied, her voice sounding unnaturally formal in the vast emptiness. "What do you need?" He finally met her gaze, and the desperation she saw there was like a physical blow. "I need you to pretend to be my wife," he stated, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a frozen lake. He paused, letting the impossible statement hang in the air. "Tomorrow." Emma stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Her mind raced, searching for a logical explanation, a joke, a bizarre test of her composure. But the look on his face was devoid of humor. It was the stark, unvarnished expression of a man at the absolute end of his rope. I don't understand," she stammered, the shield of her professionalism shattering. He took a deep, unsteady breath, the first crack in his formidable composure. "My family," he began, the words clipped. "They're controlling. Christmas with them isn't a celebration. It is a tribunal, an annual review of my life choices. They've been pressuring me to settle down, to present a stable front for the sake of the family image." He gestured vaguely toward the window, at the city sleeping below. "I need to walk into that house tomorrow with a partner, a wife, a united front they can't penetrate." He looked back at her, his gaze intense. "I chose you because you are discreet, you are professional, and you are the only person in this entire company who treats me like a boss. Not a prize to be won." The proposal was absurd, humiliating. It was a request to be a prop in his family drama. A wave of indignation washed over her. "No," she said, the words sharper than she intended. She stood up, gathering her coat, her heart pounding with a mixture of shock and offense. "I am sorry, Mr. Cross, but I can't do that." She was turning to leave, to escape the sheer insanity of the moment. When his voice stopped her, it was no longer the voice of a CEO. It was quiet, stripped of all authority, laced with desperation that was utterly disarming. $200,000, Emma. She froze, her back to him. I will wire $200,000 to your account, he continued, his voice low and urgent. For 4 days of your time from tomorrow morning until the day after Boxing Day. The number slammed into her like a physical force, knocking the air from her lungs. It wasn't just a random astronomical figure. It was the figure. The exact amount needed to pay off the reverse mortgage, threatening to swallow her grandmother's small, weathered house. The only real home Emma had ever known. It was the sum of all her sleepless nights, her double shifts, her quiet, frantic prayers. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she slowly turned to face him. The storm in his eyes was still there, but now she could see the shipwrecked man at its center. I accept, she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. A wave of profound relief washed over his features, softening the hard lines of his face for a fleeting second. He gave a single, sharp nod, but just as quickly, the relief was gone, replaced by an expression of grave seriousness. Good, he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual command. But there is a condition, one rule that cannot, under any circumstances, be broken. The way he said it, the sudden chill that returned to his tone, sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. The deal had been struck, but the true cost was yet to be revealed. The walk to his office was the longest 10 yards of Emma's life. The silence between them was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a living entity, thick with the weight of the transaction that had just occurred. He led the way, his posture once again erect and unyielding. The desperate man from her cubicle, replaced by the formidable CEO. His office was a minimalist fortress of glass and steel floating high above the city. It was a space designed for control, for power, for decisions that shaped markets and lives. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom. A sleek tablet lay on the polished surface of his massive desk, glowing with the cold blue-white light of a legal document. He didn't ask her to sit. He stood on the opposite side of the desk, creating a barrier between them. The rule is simple, Nathaniel said, his voice devoid of warmth. It was the same tone he used when discussing quarterly earnings reports, crisp, detached, absolute. This is a performance. A business arrangement. Under no circumstances are we to develop genuine romantic feelings for one another. He paused, his gaze sharp and analytical, as if searching her face for any sign of emotional liability. If either of us, he continued, emphasizing each word, begins to feel any form of authentic attachment, the contract mandates an immediate confession. Upon that confession, the agreement is instantly terminated. Emma's blood ran cold. It was a punishment for having a heart, a safeguard designed not to protect the contract, but to protect him. And there is a second part to that condition, he added, his tone becoming even more clinical. To avoid any conflicts of interest or residual complications after the arrangement concludes, your position will be transferred. A comparable role has already been secured for you at our London headquarters. It is a promotion, technically, a clean break, a discard clause. For Emma, who had spent her life being moved from one place to another, a perpetual guest in other people's lives. The words were a familiar, painful echo. She was being hired to be a temporary fixture, with her obsolescence already planned. But the $200,000 was a tangible, life-altering reality. This was just business. She could handle it. She had to. I understand, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. With a trembling hand, she reached for the tablet and signed her name on the digital line. The word accepted glowed on the screen, sealing her fate. One last thing, he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. He moved from behind the desk, his presence suddenly filling the space around her. My family is traditional. The story needs to be convincing. We need a foundation. He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside, nestled against the dark fabric, was a ring, a simple, elegant band, with a single clear stone that seemed to capture and hold the cold light of the office. It was understated, tasteful, radiating a quiet old-world quality. We were married a month ago, he said, his voice a low murmur, as if coaching her for a role. A secret ceremony? It was impulsive, a whirlwind. We were deeply in love and didn't want the interference of my family. He took her left hand. His fingers were cool, his touch unexpectedly gentle as he slid the ring onto her finger. The slide of cool metal against her skin was a sudden, startling spark of warmth in the sterile room. It settled at the base of her finger, its weight both foreign and profound, a symbol of a lie that was already beginning to feel dangerously real. She looked from the ring to his face. He was looking down at her hand, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to the Cross family, Mrs. Cross," he said, his voice once again formal. But as he raised his head, his eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker in their depths. A flash of emotion she couldn't decipher, a ghost of vulnerability that was gone as quickly as it appeared. The drive to the Cross estate was a silent rehearsal. Nathaniel drove with focused, almost grim intensity, the city's festive lights blurring into streaks of color past the windows. Emma sat beside him, the unfamiliar weight of the ring on her finger, a constant cold reminder of the role she was about to play. They turned off the main road and passed through imposing iron gates. A long, winding driveway cut through a landscape of ancient snow, dusted trees, finally revealing the house. It wasn't a home, it was a statement. A sprawling stone manor, its architecture severe and unyielding, glittering with thousands of perfectly placed white lights. The effect was not one of warmth or welcome, but of cold, crystalline perfection, like a palace carved from ice. As Nathaniel parked the car, he turned to her, his expression serious. "Just follow my lead. Don't let them see you are nervous. They feed on weakness." Before she could respond, the heavy oak door of the mansion swung open. A woman stood silhouetted in the warm glow of the entryway, her posture ramrod straight, her presence as formidable as the house itself. As they approached, Emma could see her face, elegant, sharp, featured, adorned with a smile that was a masterpiece of social engineering. It did not reach her eyes. "Nathaniel," the woman said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "You are late." Her gaze slid from her son to Emma, conducting a swift, dismissive appraisal. And this must be the surprise. "Mother, this is Emma," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. He moved to Emma's side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The gesture was a clear signal, a public claiming. The warmth of his palm seeped through the fabric of her coat, a small point of heat in the chilling atmosphere. "My wife." If Victoria Cross was shocked, she gave no sign, save for a fractional tightening of her smile. "Wife," she repeated, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. How unexpected. The next hour was a blur of introductions. Emma was presented to a tribunal of perfectly dressed, subtly hostile faces. There was Nathaniel's father, Richard, a distant silver-haired patriarch who acknowledged her with a curt nod before turning away. His older brother, Marcus, whose handshake was limp and whose eyes were filled with bored skepticism. And his younger sister, Isabel. A woman with a predatory glint in her eye and a smile that was a carbon copy of her mother's. The air in the drawing room was thin and brittle. Each word spoken weighed down with years of unspoken resentments and rivalries. They played their parts. Nathaniel was the attentive, devoted husband, never moving far from Emma's side, his touch a constant reassuring pressure. He recounted their rehearsed story, the whirlwind romance, the secret elopement, with smooth, convincing charm that Emma found both impressive and deeply unsettling. The true test came at dinner. The dining room was cavernous, the table a mile, long stretch of polished mahogany and glittering silver. The conversation was a minefield of veiled insults and passive, aggressive jabs, all directed at Nathaniel under the guise of polite inquiry. It was Isabel who fired the first direct shot at Emma. "It is just so curious, Emma," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she set her wine glass down. "Nathan never mentioned you, not once. For a man so madly in love, he was terribly discreet." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Where exactly did you two meet?" The table fell silent. Every eye turned to Emma, her heart hammered against her ribs. It was a detail they had overlooked, a hole in their carefully constructed fiction. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, her mind a frantic, blank slate. She was about to stammer some pathetic, unconvincing reply when she felt a firm squeeze on her hand under the table. Nathaniel's grip was a silent command. "I've got this." He leaned back in his chair, his expression relaxed, almost amused. He looked directly at his sister, his gaze cool and unwavering. "We met in a place where people are honest and the coffee is cheap," he said, his voice calm and clear. He gave Emma's hand another gentle squeeze. "A place you wouldn't be caught dead in, Isabel." A collective sharp intake of breath rippled around the table. The response was not just a defense, it was a counterattack. A perfectly aimed dart that hit its mark with deadly precision. Isabel's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine anger flashing in her eyes. Nathaniel turned his head to look at Emma, and in that moment, under the glare of his family's hostile scrutiny, he gave her a look that was something other than performance. It was a look of alliance, of shared victory. For the first time since she'd stepped into this gilded cage, Emma felt a flicker of something unexpected. She felt like they were a team. After the tense, protracted ordeal of dinner, Victoria rose from her seat, her expression a mask of practiced hospitality. "It has been a long day," she announced, her gaze sweeping over Nathaniel and Emma. "I am sure you are both exhausted." She led them up the grand, curving staircase, her heels clicking softly on the marble. The hallway of the second floor was a long gallery of ancestral portraits, their painted eyes seeming to follow Emma's every move. Victoria stopped before a set of double doors at the end of the hall. "As newlyweds," she said, turning to them with a smile that held a distinct malicious glint, "I've taken the liberty of preparing the master guest suite for you. I trust you'll find it comfortable." The unspoken implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was a strategic move, a test designed to see if their marriage could withstand the pressure of forced proximity. The suite was breathtaking. It was larger than Emma's entire apartment, with a four-poster bed that dominated the center of the room, a fireplace with embers glowing softly, and a private balcony overlooking the snow-covered grounds. It was a room built for intimacy, for romance. For them, it was a beautifully decorated cage. The moment the door clicked shut behind Victoria, the fragile alliance they'd formed at dinner evaporated. The air crackled with new, palpable tension. They stood on opposite sides of the vast room, two strangers forced into a shared, intimate space. "I'll take the sofa," Nathaniel said immediately, his voice flat. He didn't look at her, already shrugging out of his suit jacket and tossing it onto a chair with a weary gesture. The confident man who had so expertly defended her at dinner was gone, replaced by a guarded, distant stranger. They moved around the space with careful, awkward choreography, avoiding eye contact, each acutely aware of the other's presence. The silence was louder than any conversation. Emma retreated to the cavernous marble bathroom to change, her heart pounding. When she emerged in a simple cotton pajama set, he was already settled on the long velvet sofa, a single blanket pulled up to his chest, his back to her. Sleep did not come easily. Emma lay stiffly in the center of the enormous bed, the fine linen sheets feeling cold against her skin. She listened to the sound of his quiet, even breathing from across the room, a strange and unsettlingly intimate rhythm in the darkness. Hours later, she was pulled from a light, restless doze by a sound. It was a low, guttural noise, thick with pain. She sat up, her senses on high alert, and listened. It came again, a choked cry from the direction of the sofa. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she slipped out of bed. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she crept across the room. In the dim light filtering through the balcony doors, she could see him. He was no longer lying peacefully. He was contorted, tangled in the blanket, his body rigid with tension. His face, usually so controlled, was a mask of anguish. "No," he muttered, his voice a ragged whisper broken by sleep. "Please don't go." The words were a raw, unguarded plea, a glimpse into a private hell she had no right to witness. The powerful, untouchable CEO was gone. In his place was a man trapped in a nightmare, his defenses completely dismantled. A wave of compassion so strong it was almost a physical force washed over her. It overrode the rules of their contract, the awkwardness between them, everything. She knelt on the floor beside the sofa, her hand hovering over his shoulder for a moment before she found the courage to touch him. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice soft. She gently shook his shoulder. "Nathan, wake up. It is okay. You are just dreaming." He jolted awake with a sharp, ragged gasp, his eyes flying open. They were wide with wild, primal panic. He stared at her, but for a terrifying second, he didn't seem to see her. He was looking through her, still caught in the tendrils of his dream. And in that moment, she saw him, truly saw him. The mask of the calculating CEO, the cold armor of the crosshair. It was all gone. Stripped away by the night, he was just a man, haunted, vulnerable, utterly alone. A fragile, unspoken truce settled between them in the morning light. The shared, secret vulnerability of the night had changed something. They moved around each other with new, cautious awareness. The awkwardness replaced by quiet, hesitant curiosity. When their eyes met over the breakfast table, he didn't look away. He held her gaze for a fraction of a second. A silent acknowledgement of the moment she'd witnessed. A flicker of gratitude in the depths of his guarded expression. Christmas morning at the Cross estate was not an event of joyous, chaotic paper tearing. It was a formal, almost solemn affair held in the grand drawing room. The family gathered, their faces composed, as uniformed staff presented each person with exquisitely wrapped, ostentatiously expensive gifts. It was a performance of affection, a transaction of luxury goods with no real sentiment attached. When the staff member approached Emma, she felt a familiar flush of anxiety. She had nothing for Nathaniel. In the whirlwind of the last 24 hours, the thought hadn't even occurred to her. I didn't know," she began. Her voice a low murmur meant only for him as he sat beside her on the silk brocade sofa. "It is fine," he interrupted smoothly, his voice equally quiet. "I didn't get you anything either. We're newlyweds. Our presence is the present." His public excuse was seamless, but the brief, reassuring glance he gave her felt private and real. Later, after the hollow ceremony was complete, Emma escaped to the one room in the house that felt like a sanctuary. The library, it was 2 stories of floor, to ceiling books, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. She was running her fingers over the spine of a worn volume when he found her. He stood in the doorway watching her for a moment before speaking. "I lied," he said softly. He walked toward her, his hands behind his back. He stopped in front of her and brought his hands forward. He was holding a small, awkwardly wrapped package. The paper was creased, the tape uneven, as if it had been wrapped in a hurry by someone unaccustomed to the task. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a book. A small hardcover first edition of The Little Prince. The very book she had mentioned in passing weeks ago during a conversation about a charity literacy drive. She had said it was the one book from her constantly changing childhood that she'd always tried to find again. "How did you?" she whispered, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I listen when you speak, Emma," he answered simply, his voice quiet. The statement was a confession, an admission that he saw her as more than just an efficient assistant, that her words registered and held meaning for him. Tears pricked her eyes. This was more than a gift. It was proof that she was seen, that she mattered. Overwhelmed, she felt a desperate urge to give him something in return, something real in this house of hollow gestures. "Wait here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She hurried back to the guest suite and retrieved the single sheet of paper she'd tucked into her bag. It was a small sketch she'd drawn late last night, unable to sleep. A simple charcoal drawing of the view from their balcony, a lone snow, covered oak tree standing starkly against the winter sky. She returned to the library and handed it to him without a word. It was a simple, deeply personal offering, the only thing of value she had to give. He took the paper from her, his gaze dropping to the sketch. He stared at it, his expression unreadable. He ran his thumb gently over the charcoal lines, a gesture of unexpected reverence. When he finally looked up, the cool, analytical mask was gone. His eyes were filled with raw, unguarded emotion that made her breath catch. He looked at the simple drawing as if it were the most valuable thing he'd ever held. In a house full of priceless objects, this small piece of paper, this fragment of her soul, was the first real Christmas present he'd received in a very long time. The gift exchange had irrevocably shifted the ground beneath them. The small personal offerings, a remembered book, a heartfelt sketch, had created a bond that was stronger and more real than any feigned intimacy they'd performed for his family. An invisible thread now connected them, a shared secret of genuine sentiment in a house devoid of it. Later that afternoon, as thick, silent snowflakes began to drift down from a pearl gray sky, the oppressive atmosphere of the manor became unbearable. The family had dispersed to their respective corners, leaving a vacuum of strained silence. "I need some air," Nathaniel announced abruptly, appearing at Emma's side as she stared out a window. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request, but the look in his eyes was an invitation, a plea for temporary escape. They bundled up in heavy coats and stepped out into the hushed white world. The air was crisp and clean, a welcome antidote to the suffocating stillness of the house. They walked without a destination, their footsteps muffled by the fresh layer of snow, their breath pluming in the cold air. Here, away from the prying eyes and judgmental silences of his family, the walls between them began to crumble. The formal barrier of boss and employee, of contractor and contract, dissolved into the winter mist. "I used to love this," he said, his voice quiet as he looked up at the falling snow. "Before it just became the backdrop for the annual Inquisition." He spoke of the immense, crushing pressure of being across, the lonely burden of a name that was both privilege and prison. He didn't speak with self-pity, but with weary resignation that resonated with deep, hidden sadness. Emboldened by his honesty, Emma found herself sharing pieces of her own story. She spoke of her childhood, a patchwork of different homes and temporary families, of the constant gnawing ache for a place to truly belong. She spoke of her grandmother, the one constant in her life, and the fierce protective love she felt for the woman who had given her a home when no one else would. They were just two people walking in the snow, sharing the quiet truths of their lives. As they ventured deeper into the woods that bordered the property, Emma, distracted by the beauty of a cardinal perched on a snow-laden branch, didn't see the gnarled root hidden just beneath the powder. Her foot caught and sharp, searing pain shot up her ankle. She cried out, stumbling, her balance gone. Before she could hit the ground, he was there. He moved with speed and instinct that stunned her. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back from the fall and steadying her against his solid frame. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. "I think so," she said, wincing as she tried to put weight on her foot. The pain was immediate and sharp. "No, I think I twisted it." Without a moment's hesitation, he acted. "Don't move." He knelt in the snow, his movements efficient and sure as he gently examined her ankle. "It is swelling," he diagnosed, his tone shifting into calm authority, and then before she could protest or even process what was happening, he stood up, bent down, and scooped her effortlessly into his arms. The world tilted, and suddenly she was being held securely against his chest. The gesture was so unexpected, so primal in its strength and care, it left her breathless. He began the walk back to the house, carrying her as if she weighed nothing. She was acutely aware of everything. The steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her ear, the solid strength of his arms around her, the scent of pine and cold air that clung to his coat. Back in the warmth of their suite, he gently deposited her on the sofa. He tended to her ankle with surprising tenderness, his touch firm and clinical, yet profoundly gentle. He wrapped it expertly, his fingers moving with practiced, soothing confidence. The contact was different from the calculated public touches he'd used before. This was not a performance. This was real. His proximity was overwhelming, his focused care and active intimacy more potent than any kiss. As he knelt before her, his head bent in concentration, she could feel the undeniable pull between them. A magnetic force that had nothing to do with their contract and everything to do with the man who was so gently caring for her. The annual Cross Christmas party was the main event of the holiday, a grand affair where Nathaniel's parents showcased their wealth and influence. The house, already opulent, was transformed into a glittering spectacle of festive excess. Hundreds of guests, a veritable who is who of the city's elite, filled the rooms with a cacophony of polite laughter and whispered gossip. Emma, with her ankle neatly wrapped and propped up on a velvet footstool, felt like an exhibit in a museum. She was seated in a slightly secluded alcove of the main ballroom, a strategic position chosen by Nathaniel to minimize her need to walk. He had not left her side for more than a few minutes at a time, playing the part of the devoted, attentive husband to perfection. He brought her drinks, introduced her to select guests with a proud arm around her shoulders, and deflected any intrusive questions with effortless, charming authority. His performance was flawless, too flawless. The way he looked at her, the proprietary hand on her shoulder, the soft murmur of his voice in her ear as he pointed out a particularly ridiculous guest, it all felt dangerously, intoxicatingly real. They were sharing a quiet moment, laughing at a private joke, when Isabel materialized before them, a triumphant, venomous smile on her face. She was holding a small festive sprig in her hand. Well, she purred, dangling the plant directly above their heads. It was a lush green branch with pearlescent white berries. Mistletoe. Look where you are sitting. You can't break with tradition, can you? A hush fell over the immediate vicinity. Several guests turned to watch, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. It was a trap, a public test of their authenticity, and Isabel was its gleeful architect. The air crackled with expectation. Nathan went still. He looked from his sister's smug face to the expectant crowd, and then his eyes met Emma's. The charming mask fell away, and in his gaze she saw a single silent question. What do we do? This was it, the precipice. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She could shake her head, laugh it off as a silly game, and they could weather the ensuing gossip. But as she looked at him, at the man who had defended her, cared for her, shared his secrets with her, she realized she didn't want to. She gave him the barest, almost imperceptible nod. It is okay. Permission granted. He turned his full attention back to her, the rest of the room ceasing to exist. The world narrowed to the space between their faces. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin in a gesture of breathtaking tenderness. And then he kissed her. It started as a performance, a soft, chaste press of lips for the benefit of their audience. But the moment their lips touched, a jolt of electricity, pure and undeniable, shot through them both. The performance shattered. The kiss deepened, becoming something else entirely. It was soft, searching, and filled with all the unspoken words, the shared glances, and the fragile, burgeoning emotions of the past 2 days. It was a confession. The roar of the party faded to a distant hum. There was no contract, no family, no pretense. There was only the warmth of his lips on hers, the gentle strength of his hand on her face, the dizzying, terrifying, beautiful truth of the moment. When he finally pulled away, they were both shaken, their breathing ragged. They stared at each other, the shock and wonder of what had just happened reflected in their wide eyes. The kiss had not been a lie, and in that shared, silent realization, they both knew with terrifying certainty that they had just broken the most important rule of all. The applause and appreciative murmurs from the surrounding guests were distant, meaningless noise. Nathan and Emma were trapped in a bubble of their own silent, shared shock. Without a word, Nathaniel stood, his expression a tight mask. He gently took her hand, helped her to her feet, and with a curt nod to the stunned onlookers, guided her from the ballroom. He led her through a series of quiet hallways, his grip on her hand firm and unwavering, until they reached the sanctuary of the library. He closed the heavy oak doors behind them, plunging the room into hushed, intimate silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. He released her hand and walked to the fireplace, turning his back to her. He braced his hands on the marble mantelpiece, his shoulders rigid with tension. "That should not have happened," he said. His voice a low, rough rasp that was swallowed by the vastness of the room. Emma stood by the door, her heart still beating a frantic, unsteady rhythm. The ghost of the kiss lingered on her lips, a warm, tingling reminder of their transgression. "We broke the rule," she whispered, the words feeling like a final, damning verdict. The reality of their situation crashed down on her with brutal force. The contract, the confession clause, the transfer, the clean break. The end. He finally turned to face her, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound, it stole her breath. The cool, controlled CEO was gone, replaced by a man torn apart by his own impossible laws. "The contract is clear," she continued, her voice trembling as she forced herself to speak the truth they were both avoiding. "We have to end this now." The words hung between them, a death sentence for something that had only just begun to live. The thought of leaving, of being sent away to London, of never seeing him again except as a name on a corporate memo, was a physical pain, a sharp twisting ache in her chest. "I don't want to," he admitted. The confession ripped from him, a raw, desperate sound. He took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't want this to end, Emma." His words, a mirror of the frantic plea in her own heart, broke through her resolve. "I don't either," she confessed, her voice cracking, the sound fragile in the quiet room. They stared at each other across the space, caught in an impossible, agonizing impasse. The very contract that had brought them together now demanded their separation, just as they had finally, irrevocably, found each other. They were bound by a rule they had both willingly, recklessly broken. He closed the distance between them, stopping just inches from her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the desperate conflict warring in his eyes. "We have one more day," he said, his voice a low, pleading whisper. "Tomorrow, Boxing Day. The agreement isn't officially over until the morning after." He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. Let's pretend for one more day. Not for my family. For us. Let's pretend that this is real, just until we have to leave." It was a foolish, reckless request, a postponement of the inevitable pain. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew she was just as foolish, just as reckless. She wanted one more day of this beautiful, impossible truth. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. One more day. Their final day at the Cross estate was a masterpiece of bittersweet torture. Their agreement to pretend for us had erased the last vestiges of performance. What remained was something achingly, beautifully real, lived out under the shadow of a ticking clock. Every shared laugh felt more precious, every stolen glance more profound, because they both knew it was finite. The shift in their dynamic was a palpable force, and even the Cross family, masters of observing social subtleties, could not miss it. The desperate, performative affection of the first day had been replaced by quiet, confident intimacy. The way he instinctively reached for her hand, the way she leaned into him when he spoke. The easy shared smiles that passed between them. It was a seamless, natural dance. Their authenticity had an unexpected effect. Seeing his son genuinely happy, genuinely connected to someone, seemed to disarm the distant patriarch. Richard engaged Emma in a brief, surprisingly pleasant conversation about her interest in art. Isabel, having lost her primary weapon, retreated into sullen silence. The most startling transformation was in Victoria. During a quiet moment in the afternoon, she found Emma alone, looking at the family photos arranged on a grand piano. "He is different with you," Victoria stated, her voice softer than Emma had ever heard it. It wasn't an accusation, it was a simple, unadorned observation. She looked at Emma, and for the first time her smile was not a social weapon, but a small, hesitant gesture of approval. "It is good to see." They were selling the lie so perfectly that it had convinced everyone, including the family it was designed to deceive. The irony was a sharp, painful twist in Emma's heart. The breaking point, the final intrusion of reality, came not from a family member, but from the vibration of her phone. She excused herself and stepped onto a cold, secluded stone terrace to answer it. It was her grandmother. Her voice was a cascade of joyous, tearful relief. The bank had called. The wire transfer had cleared. The payment was accepted. The house was safe. It was theirs, free and clear. "You did it, Emma," her grandmother cried. "I don't know how, but you saved us. It is a Christmas miracle." Emma leaned against the cold stone railing, the world tilting under her feet. The news should have been a tidal wave of relief, the triumphant culmination of her sacrifice. But instead, it felt like a death sentence. The reason for the contract, the entire foundation of her presence in this house, in his life, was gone. She had no more excuses. The game was over. She found Nathaniel in the library staring into the fire. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a warm, genuine smile that faltered the moment he saw her expression. He asked, his voice instantly laced with concern. "My grandmother called," she said, her own voice sounding distant. "Hollow, the money went through. The house is safe." He stood there, processing her words. He should have been happy for her. He was happy for her. But the profound, gut-wrenching finality of her statement overshadowed everything else. The purpose of their arrangement had been fulfilled. "I am happy for you, Emma," he said, and she knew he meant it. But the pain that flashed in his eyes was unmistakable, a raw, unguarded wound. "I really am." The lie was officially over. All that was left was the goodbye. The morning after Boxing Day dawned cold and gray, the sky a perfect mirror of the mood inside the car. The farewell at the Grand Oak door had been the final scene of their play. Victoria had been surprisingly warm, kissing Emma's cheek and making her promise to call. Richard had shaken her hand, a flicker of respect in his eyes. They had played their roles to the very end, a convincing portrait of a happy couple leaving after a family holiday. The moment the heavy doors of the car clicked shut, the performance ended. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was immense and suffocating, a physical presence pressing down on them. Nathan's hand, which had been resting on the small of her back just moments before, retreated to the steering wheel. His posture stiffened. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. They didn't look at each other. They couldn't. The intimacy of the past few days had been stripped away, leaving them raw and exposed. They were once again Mr. Cross, the CEO, and Emma Chen, his assistant. Two strangers bound by a contract that was now nothing more than a source of mutual, agonizing pain. Every mile that passed was a countdown to the inevitable end. The city skyline, once a distant promise, grew larger, more defined, each building a tombstone marking the death of their beautiful temporary reality. Halfway back, without a word, Nathaniel slowed the car and pulled over onto a deserted scenic lookout. The spot overlooked a vast frozen lake, its surface a sheet of milky white under the overcast sky. He cut the engine. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening. He kept his gaze fixed on the frozen expanse, unable to look at her. "Emma," he began, his voice rough, strained, as if the words themselves were a physical effort. "The contract, we don't have to follow it to the letter." He finally turned to face her, and the desperation in his eyes was a gut punch. "The transfer clause," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We can ignore it. You don't have to go." His offer hung in the air, a fragile, desperate lifeline. A part of her, a wild, screaming part, wanted to grab it, to say yes, to stay, to figure out the rest later. But her mind, sharpened by a lifetime of pragmatism and self-preservation, saw the flaw in his desperate plan. She looked at him, her heart aching with calm, profound sadness. "And then what? Nathaniel?" she asked, her voice quiet but unwavering. "What happens then? I go back to being your assistant. We walk past each other in the office every day and pretend this weekend never happened. I watch you go into meetings knowing I can never be with you, knowing we both broke the one rule you built your entire world around." She took a shaky breath, the truth of her own words twisting like a knife inside her. That wouldn't be a solution. It would be a special kind of torture. She finally met his gaze, her own eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "It is better this way. A clean break, your words." The cold, inescapable logic of her argument struck him silent. He had no counter. He knew she was right. He had designed the trap himself, and now they were both caught in it. The pain that flooded his face was so raw, so complete, that she had to look away. He started the car again, the engine's roar a brutal intrusion into their shared misery. He pulled back onto the highway, and they drove the rest of the way in heavy, heartbroken silence, leaving the frozen lake and their last desperate hope behind them. Emma's last day at the New York headquarters was a surreal, out-of-body experience. The office, once a place of familiar, comforting routine, now felt like a foreign country. The cheerful, "We'll miss you," and "Good luck in London" from her colleagues were like pinpricks against the raw, gaping wound of her heartbreak. She smiled. She thanked them. She played the part of an employee excited about a promotion, all while her inner world was collapsing. She spent the day methodically packing the contents of her desk into a small cardboard box. Each item, a framed photo of her grandmother, a chipped coffee mug, a collection of well-worn pens, was a relic from a life that no longer felt like her own. She avoided looking toward the glass walls of Nathaniel's office, But she could feel his presence, a magnetic pull she had to consciously resist. He didn't emerge all day. He was a ghost in his own fortress, a silent, unseen presence at the heart of the bustling office. At precisely 5 o'clock, her desk phone rang. The caller ID was his private line. Emma. His voice was formal, devoid of all emotion. Could you come in for your final transfer meeting? The formality was absurd, a cruel parody of their usual professional interactions. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked the familiar path to his office for the last time. He was standing by the window, staring out at the city, his back to the door. He didn't turn when she entered. The board has officially approved the transfer, he said to the glass, his voice a monotone. Your flight to London is confirmed for 7 a.m. tomorrow. A car will be at your apartment at 4. He was reciting facts, closing out a transaction. There was no trace of the man who had held her in his arms, who had kissed her under the mistletoe, who had looked at her sketch as if it were a priceless treasure. Thank you for your assistance this weekend, Emma, he added, the words sounding stiff and rehearsed. It was successful. A cold, quiet anger began to burn through her grief. Was that all it was to him now, a successful transaction? She wouldn't let him hide behind his corporate armor. She wouldn't let their story end this way. Nathaniel, wait, she said, her voice quiet but firm, stopping him as he began to recite details about her moving allowance. She walked slowly toward his desk, with deliberate, steady movements. She pulled the engagement ring from her finger. The skin underneath was pale, indented. The ring felt warm from her skin as she placed it gently on the polished, empty surface of his desk. The small, elegant object looked lost and achingly sad in the vast, sterile space. The gesture was final, a quiet, definitive end to their fictional marriage. He finally turned from the window, his eyes locked on the ring, then lifted to her face. The mask of cool detachment was gone, and his expression was one of pure, undiluted pain. I don't want it, he said, his voice low and rough. Keep it. A sad smile touched her lips. Thank you, Nathan, but, she replied softly, it was never really mine. She held his gaze for one last, heartbreaking moment, memorizing the face of the man she loved and was about to leave forever. Then she turned and walked out of his office, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She left him alone in his glass fortress with a small, glittering ring and the deafening, soul-crushing silence of the life he had chosen. A week passed. For Emma, London was a city painted in shades of gray. The rain was a constant, weeping drizzle that mirrored the perpetual ache in her chest. She moved through the motions of her new life like a ghost. Her new apartment was modern and spacious. Her new colleagues were pleasant. Her new role was challenging. She had the financial security she had sacrificed everything for. The peace of mind knowing her grandmother was safe. By every logical measure, she had won. But she had never felt so profoundly poor. The emptiness was a constant companion. Every cup of coffee reminded her of the cheap diner where their fictional story began. Every passing glance at a bookstore made her think of the worn copy of The Little Prince she now kept on her nightstand. She was safe, but she was hollowed out. In New York, Nathaniel's life was a study in opulent emptiness. The silence in his penthouse, once a coveted sanctuary, was now a roaring, oppressive void. He would walk past the closed door of the guest suite, and the absence of her presence was a physical blow. The office, his kingdom, felt sterile and meaningless. He found himself staring at her empty desk, a phantom limb he could still feel, half expecting her to walk in with a cheerful, "Good morning, Mr. Cross." He had what he'd always thought he wanted. His family placated, his life orderly and free of emotional complications. He had achieved peace, but he discovered that peace without her was just another word for loneliness. He had surgically removed the one variable that made his sterile, controlled world worth living in. One night, unable to sleep, he found himself in his home office. He was aimlessly running his hand along a stack of papers when his fingers brushed against a single sheet tucked between two reports. He pulled it out. It was her sketch, the simple charcoal drawing of the lone snow-covered oak tree. He stared at it, and the memory of that day, of her face when she gave it to him, of the genuine, unvarnished sentiment in the gesture, hit him with the force of a physical impact. This small piece of paper held more truth, more warmth, more life than anything else in his perfectly curated world. In that instant, the last of his carefully constructed walls of logic and self-preservation crumbled into dust. He had been a fool, a brilliant, cowardly fool who had let the greatest thing that had ever happened to him walk away because of a rule he had written in a different lifetime to protect himself from a different kind of pain. He strode to his desk, his movements filled with sudden, desperate purpose. He picked up his phone and dialed his new, hyper-efficient assistant, Claire. It was after midnight, but he didn't care. "Cancel everything," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. "All my meetings for the next week. I don't care what they are. And get me on the first flight to London. Now." He hung up before she could respond. He opened the top drawer of his desk. The ring lay there, cold and glittering in the dim light. He picked it up, its familiar weight settling in his palm, and closed his fist around it. He had no plan, no strategy, no logical argument. All he had was the stark, undeniable certainty that he had made the biggest mistake of his life, and he would tear down the world to fix it. The London rain was a cold, persistent mist that clung to everything, blurring the edges of the city into a watercolor of gray and steel. Emma pulled the collar of her coat tighter as she stepped out of the anonymous glass tower of her new office building. It was the end of another long, empty day, a day she had survived by focusing solely on the tasks in front of her, building a wall of work to keep the memories at bay. She felt utterly, completely alone, a solitary figure adrift in a city of strangers. As she waited for the light to change, her gaze drifted absently across the street. And then her heart stopped. Through the veil of rain, she saw a figure, a man, standing perfectly still on the opposite corner, holding a single black umbrella. His posture was unmistakable, an island of quiet intensity in the bustling river of commuters. Even from a distance, she could feel the force of his presence. It was Nathaniel. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the city fading to a dull, distant roar. He wasn't looking at the traffic or the light. He was looking only at her. As if in a dream, she watched him step off the curb and walk across the street, the flow of traffic parting around him as if by an invisible force. He stopped directly in front of her, the umbrella shielding them both from the rain. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, the words barely audible over the frantic pounding of her own heart. He looked at her, his face stripped of all its usual masks. There was no CEO, no cross air. There was only a man, his eyes filled with raw, desperate vulnerability that mirrored what she felt in her own soul. The rain dripped from the edges of the umbrella, creating a small, intimate world just for them on the busy sidewalk. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he no longer tried to conceal. A catastrophic, life-altering mistake. He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth of his body. "I spent my whole life building walls to keep feelings out. I wrote contracts to control variables. And then you came along, and you weren't a variable I could solve. You were everything." His voice broke, and he had to stop to compose himself. "I followed the rules of our contract when I should have been following my heart. I let you go because I was a coward. I let you go. And it was the single stupidest, most unforgivable decision of my life." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his hand, opening it. The ring lay in the center of his palm, its simple elegance a stark contrast to the raw emotion of the moment. "I know this ring was the symbol of a lie," he said, his gaze holding hers, intense and pleading. "But I want it to become the symbol of a promise. A promise that I will spend the rest of my life making this right. A promise that I will never, ever let you go again." He didn't get on one knee. He didn't ask a question. He simply stood there in the rain, offering her the ring, offering her his heart, his entire world held in the palm of his hand. It was a silent, desperate, beautiful invitation to come home. Tears streamed down Emma's face, hot against her cold skin, mingling with the cool London rain. She stared at the ring glittering in his palm, a tiny beacon of hope in the gray twilight. Everything he had said, every crack in his voice, every ounce of raw emotion in his eyes, was a testament to a truth she had been too afraid to believe in. He had come back for her entire life. She had been the one left behind, the one who had to adapt, to move on, to make a new life from the pieces of the old one. She was the temporary foster child, the quiet new girl, the assistant whose departure was planned before her arrival. No one had ever turned around. No one had ever crossed an ocean in the rain just to stand on a street corner and say they had made a mistake. Until now, he had chosen her. Not as a convenience, not as a solution to a family problem, but as the essential, irreplaceable center of his world. With a trembling hand, she reached out, but not for the ring. She gently took his hand, her fingers curling over his, closing them around the small, precious object. His eyes widened in a flash of heart, stopping fear, misinterpreting her action. "I don't want the ring, Nathaniel," she said softly. And she saw the hope drain from his face, his expression crumbling. She tightened her grip on his hand, holding on tight. "I want the man who is holding it," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and a joy so overwhelming it felt like it could lift her off the ground. The relief that washed over his face was absolute, a sunrise after a long, dark night. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And then there were no more words. She launched herself into his arms, her hands tangling in his hair, her mouth finding his. She kissed him with all the pent-up longing, all the heartbreak, all the desperate, unspoken love of the past week. It was a kiss of homecoming, of forgiveness, of a future reclaimed from the ashes of a broken contract. He kissed her back with fierce, possessive desperation, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her slightly off her feet, holding her as if he would never let go again. The umbrella fell from his grasp, forgotten, clattering onto the wet pavement. They stood in the pouring rain, oblivious to the staring passers-by, lost in their own world. A world they had found their way back to. She finally pulled back, breathless, resting her forehead against his. "Take me home, Nathan," she whispered against his lips, the name a term of endearment she had only ever used in the privacy of her own heart. "Always," he breathed, his voice full of a promise that was more binding than any contract. "Always." The air wasn't filled with the scent of expensive, sterile floral arrangements, but with the warm, rich aroma of pine needles and freshly baked gingerbread. The light didn't come from thousands of cold, perfectly placed LEDs, but from the cheerful, dancing flames in a stone fireplace and the soft, multicolored glow of mismatched ornaments on a slightly lopsided Christmas tree. 1 year after the weekend that had shattered and remade their worlds, Emma stood in the living room of the cozy, light-filled house they had bought together. It wasn't a mansion or a fortress. It was a home. With a soft, contented smile, she reached up to hang a clumsy, handmade star on a high branch, her other hand resting gently on the swell of her stomach. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a chin came to rest on her shoulder. Nathaniel's hands joined hers, covering them in a gesture of shared protective love. "Careful, Mrs. Cross," he murmured into her ear, his voice a low, happy rumble. "We don't want you and our little passenger overexerting yourselves." She leaned back against his solid frame, her heart full to bursting. They had been married for 6 months in a quiet ceremony on a sun-drenched beach, with only her grandmother and a few close friends as witnesses. It had been perfect, real, and entirely theirs. A soft cough from the doorway drew their attention. Victoria Cross stood there, no longer the formidable matriarch, but a woman softened by a joy she had never expected. She approached them, a small silk-wrapped package in her hands. "I have something for you, Emma," she said, her voice gentle, laced with genuine, uncharacteristic emotion. Emma unwrapped the gift carefully. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a tiny hand-knitted set, a small cap and matching booties crocheted from soft, buttery yellow yarn. The set was exquisitely made, but clearly old, the color faded with time. "It was the first thing Nathaniel ever wore," Victoria explained, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she looked at her son. "The outfit I brought him home from the hospital in. I kept it all these years." She looked back at Emma, her gaze warm and full of acceptance. "I want it to be yours now, for my grandchild." The gesture, the passing down of such a precious, intimate piece of family history, was the final, unconditional welcome Emma had never known she was missing. It was an embrace into the heart of a family she was now truly a part of. Tears of pure happiness streamed down her face as she stood and hugged her mother-in-law, a heartfelt, clinging embrace that spoke volumes. Nathaniel watched them, his own heart so full it felt like it might overflow. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around both of them, the two most important women in his life, pulling them into a shared hug. Their story had started with a desperate plea on a lonely Christmas Eve, a cold contract for a weekend of lies. It ended here, in the warm glow of their own Christmas tree, with the promise of a new life on the way and the quiet, unshakable certainty that they had found there forever. Not in a clause, not in a loophole, but in the messy, beautiful, unconditional love they had built together. The contract had been a beginning, but love, real, imperfect, chosen love, was their true ending. The end.